Welcome to Live with the League, everyone, a special edition on Monday, October 6th. I'm Emily Kalashewski, the Assistant Director for Member Experience and Learning here at the League. I am joined by our State and Federal Affairs Director, John LaMacchia, to talk all things budget, which we said we'd probably do. So again, a special episode. A couple of quick reminders. If you've got questions for John, you can go ahead and post those either in the Q&A or in the chat here on Zoom, or if you're joining us via Facebook on the chat there, and we will try to get to as many as possible throughout the show. And we're going to dive right in because I know this is a topic we've sort of all been waiting for. I say sort of, no, we've been all waiting for months. John, let's start off big picture, general overview. Can you give us insight, the what we need to know on this year's state budget? What's standing out to you?
Yeah, where to start?
You know, I'm like
Yeah,
gonna crack my knuckles for you a little bit here.
yeah, and you're right. We have been waiting, and it's always good to maybe level set just a little bit. And normally we'd have this conversation in July.
Right.
Um,
It feels like July, so maybe that's part of it.
I'll take the weather. Maybe
Yeah.
not budgets in August in October, but
Right.
um, so yeah, so typically, the normal process would lead us to an October 1 budget start, but that budget would have been wrapped up by July 1. We didn't see that happen this year. And not only did we not see that happen, we actually didn't see any budget completed by midnight on September 30th. So there was a short government shutdown of about 4 hours. They passed what was a continuing budget to keep government open through October 8th. We're actually
Mhm.
still operating under that budget right now. And then that allowed them a few extra days to continue to negotiate. If you back up even a little bit before that, there was a statement released by the governor, the speaker, and the Senate Majority Leader saying that they agreed to have an agreement by October 1. It wasn't necessarily a budget agreement, just an agreement to have an agreement. And so, when we think about all the different things that were interplaying at this particular moment, there was a lot of moving parts. Very, very little was being talked about publicly, and I'll expand on that a little bit because that was maybe the most unique aspect of this budget cycle is the lack of information that we had. In
Right.
any given budget cycle, quite frankly, even on policy pieces we work on, we're able to get some inside information, ask some questions. People are able to provide us with some stuff. None of that was prevalent in this case. And one of the most shocking things to me, and there are reasons for this, and I'll talk a little bit about that too, but one of the most shocking things to me is that it really wasn't until about 6 p.m. on Thursday of last week that the majority of legislators got any details on the budget. Prior to that, there was
Mhm.
just a select few in leadership and in the administration that actually knew the details of what was being negotiated. So there was a very much a trust us in this process from legislative leaders in the administration. And that can prove to be challenging for a lot of reasons. Now, why does that happen? I think people want to know more than anything else. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, you are up against the deadline, or in this case, actually past the deadline. So you're doing things and they're changing rapidly. And the other part of it is, and just the honest truth was, is that the negotiations were very much on thin ice. And I don't mean
Mhm.
that as a bad thing, but it was very tense. There was a lot of details that needed to be worked out. And when you have sort of that fragile situation of, both negotiations and an impending government shutdown, one of the things that tends to happen is people get very insular in that case. And I think
Sure.
very directly here. And then ultimately legislators had to take a vote on that.
So, from the league's perspective, what are some of the biggest wins or concerns for Michigan communities from this budget?
Yeah.
Obviously, I know we're going to talk roads, we're going to talk about revenue sharing. Those are the big ones that we always talk about and we continue to hear. But from a general perspective, what would you say?
Yeah, from a general perspective, they had some really difficult decisions to make. And
Hmm.
I'll sort of lead with roads, but I'm not going to talk about roads only because back in March, the board took a very specific position to support the House road funding package. You
Mhm.
fast forward to October 1st, a lot had changed with that. And one of the biggest factors that led to those changes were the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill at the federal level, something that we
Mm.
weren't anticipating in that exact fashion back in March. And that put a lot of downward pressure on the state budget. So when we think about the overall picture, state budget last year was almost $83 billion. State budget this year is 76 billion. Now they have a reserve pot on top of that to deal potentially with some additional funding pressures from the Fed. So depending on how you look at it, it's either 76 or 81 billion. We really look at it as like a $76 billion budget, not
Mhm.
counting those kind of reserve funds for the what ifs. And so,
Sure.
you know, you look at that downward pressure that goes on, there's a lot of other things that need to take place. Now, if we talk about the good for a second,
Mhm.
one of the goods is, free breakfast and lunch for all students. It was a huge negotiating point in this budget, one that the governor and both House and Senate Dems wanted to maintain. Not to suggest that Republicans didn't want to maintain that, but it was really kind of the core Democratic talking point around schools and what we need to do in our funding models for them. The other thing here is this budget eliminates 1,800 FTEs or full-time employees from the state. Now, people will often ask, will that lead to layoffs? Right now, we don't believe that it will. They were just unfilled FTE positions that were eliminated. So you get some cost savings there. So between a lower budget number, getting a school aid budget done, dealing with some of the FTE stuff, the other big impact was the Department of Health and Human Services. And we
Right.
did see some reductions in the overall Health and Human Services budget, but they were able to do some policy changes, I will say. And in those policy changes, we're really able to mitigate a lot of the potential negative impacts on the Medicaid program here in the state of Michigan. So the budget in its totality, I would say whether you were speaking on behalf of the Senate Dems or House Dems or Senate Republicans or House Republicans or the governor, still a lot of positives in that budget
Mhm.
in a very difficult fiscal year in terms of managing the final outcome.
Absolutely. Well, I want to talk sort of a little bit about that, but getting more into the specifics in terms of revenue sharing, some other local gov impacts, roads, of course. Let's start with roads. The new fuel tax structure has been one of the biggest headlines. Can you explain what's changing there for folks?
Yeah. So if you don't want to be confused, I suggest you don't read Senate Bill 578. Um,
Okay.
it's a lot of percentages and breakdowns and a whole lot of different stuff. But really, there were a few key components to what happened on the roads deal. Again, just to
Yep.
sort of back up a little bit, both the governor and the House, and we talked a lot about this from a very positive standpoint. We're both talking about putting 3 billion plus into the system,
Hmm.
prioritizing local roads. Even in the House package, included our neighborhood roads proposal as we wrote it. And then both the governor and the speaker talked about backfilling constitutional revenue sharing, and we'll talk more about that in a few.
Yep.
At the end of the day, again, a lot of this, I believe, had to do with some of the budget constraints that they were dealing
Hmm.
with that weren't initially there right away, and the desire to raise new revenue. So the budget, its main component was to deal with the number one policy issue that both motorists and the legislature always talk about, which is ensuring all of the taxes paid at the pump goes to our transportation system. They were able to craft that policy and pass that policy. So we will no longer pay sales tax at the pump. And then to make it price neutral, so the actual price of gas, they increased the gas tax by 20 cents. So our gas tax in the state of Michigan has gone from 31 cents to 51 cents. That
Hmm.
additional 20 cents puts about $1 billion more into the system and would run through what we refer to as the traditional Act 51 funding formula, where the first part of that goes to our transit systems, and then you get basically the remaining 90% going to MDOT, counties, cities and villages. When you do that, and again, we'll talk about this in detail in a second, you create holes for schools, local government, and transit in addition to the general fund, because when you don't collect sales tax, that's less money that's being generated in the sales tax, and then less money that can flow through the constitutional requirements for those resources. So I often get the question is, how can the legislature cut constitutional revenue sharing? They really can't, but what they can do is impact what sales tax is charged on. So that can both have a positive or negative effect depending on the policy structure that you choose. The other components of this were one, a new wholesale tax on marijuana at
Hmm.
24%, which is supposed to raise, ironically, $420 million. So for those of you that are in tune with the marijuana culture, that may mean something to you. For those of you who don't, ask a friend. Um, but that will raise that. So that gets us to about $1.5 billion there. And then there was a real, I'll say almost swap, but what they're referring to as decoupling on the corporate income tax side. So within the one big beautiful bill, there was an aspect of the corporate income tax that would have reduced business taxes at the federal level. It would have had the same impact at the state level. The state decoupled that, so that impact won't reduce business taxes here in the state anymore. It'll just hold them harmless in that sense. And
Hmm.
as a result, they're able to take that corporate income tax, no longer put that to the governor's economic development package called SOAR, and then utilize those resources as a way in which to fund roads. So in totality, we have a 5-year roads program starting at $1.5 billion, and then we'll ramp up to about $1.9 billion, and it will send very directly more money to local roads. Again, I'll expand on that just a little bit because I kind of mentioned Senate Bill 578. In
Right.
essence, what 578 does is it takes the typical split of 39.1% going to MDOT, 39.1% going to the counties, and 21.8% going to cities and villages, really reduces the amount that MDOT is getting and increases the amount that cities and villages are getting. If I just gave you the numbers, or if you looked at them on paper, it would look almost like counties were getting way more than what cities were in this. Well, one, they get more now.
Sure.
So what the legislature did is increase their proportionate share by about 80%. So we each get that increase when we look at it over the course of that 5-year program. And when it's all said and done, about 400 million more in new resources will go to cities and villages across the state of Michigan. And that will result in about a 54% increase compared to today's dollar that you're getting.
So when we talk about this new transportation funding picture, I think my next question, and probably some of our communities, is how long will it take for local governments to see the full benefit of these new road dollars?
Yeah, that's good, right? Because at some point the check's gotta, hit the account.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
And like most things, it takes a little while to ramp this up. And I just don't mean because it's 5 years. I mean, there are
right.
processes at the state level that you can't just turn the switch and it's happening today. So this really kicks in on January 1. And
Okay.
so the first year numbers that we see, and we've posted both a blog last week and another blog this week, and there's links to those documents within there, really only reconcile 3/4 of a year worth of funding. Um,
Mm,
so when communities see the impact, they will likely see the impact and in that first check around March or April, depending on exactly when it all works. Mainly because collection lags, you're in 2 month
sure.
stuff like that. And then your first year's worth of funding, while it will be a big increase, you actually
Hmm.
get a second pretty decent increase, or a pretty decent increase in the second year, because that will be a full year's of worth of collection plus 1 year of that phase in. And then years 3, 4, and 5, you will see more moderate increases until we kind of level out. One of the big positives, actually a couple of the big positives, included in here is all 51 cents is tied to inflation. And so there will be some natural growth within that,
Hmm.
which is really, really important. And then two, transit was a big winner in this.
Yeah.
And as an organization, we've talked about the importance of investing in transit for a long time. So now we're going to couple increase resources for local road agencies with a sort of surge of about $500 million in transit investment over the next 5 years. That happens in two forms. About 175 of that will go directly into local bus operations. And then 325 million of that over the next 5 years will really go into a transformational pot meant for things like
Hmm.
bus rapid transit or light rail or regional connectors. Um, what is actually really interesting in this is so much of our focus legislatively was on, a couple of key components. If you actually look at our 8 priorities that we have within our legislative priority document, one of them is a transit piece. And it was
Right.
really modeled after something that was proposed last year. That is essentially what passed. So from an organizational standpoint, in terms of influencing spaces adjacent to our very direct work, this transit piece is really critical. And I'm guessing he's not listening, but Representative Jason Morgan was really influential in this. A huge supporter of transit, really kind of put his neck out on the line within the negotiations to try to protect that as well as some other things. So very thankful for his efforts in this.
Absolutely. Well, as we think about transit infrastructure, are there any other uh, news items or investments that are coming out in this budget that local leaders should know about?
Yeah, there's one other transit piece within this that or transportation piece that I'll mention, and I can
Hmm.
see a couple of questions here within the chat too that I can touch on.
Yeah.
But there are a few of our communities, particularly in Southeast Michigan, that deal with rail grade separation. And so there was about $40 million in here for rail grade separation. It'll total $200 million over the 5 year transportation proposal. And when I keep talking about this in 5 years, I just want to remind everybody it doesn't go away after five. It just stops the phase in, and then we'll be at a fully phase in point.
Right.
The $200 million for rail grade separation is a program with a tenure to it that'll be done after 5 years, but $200 million for that. And then I do see that there were some questions in here about money in there for voting tabulators. Yes, there is some resources in there. Yes, communities are going to have some costs associated with new tabulators here for the upcoming election. How that's going to be allocated right now, we do not know. I don't want to make it sound like we know every detail about the budget, like we're starting to become more and more familiar with it. But
Right.
for
Can you remind folks just how
yeah,
long the budget is in
yeah, the,
pages?
the budget in terms of pages is 1,006 pages.
Okay.
Now, again, we have looked at a lot of that. I wouldn't say we memorized it or read every word, but
Sure.
there are several things. And again, what's unique about this budget is it starts right away.
Hmm.
When in years past, when they do it in July, usually we're reminding people that these resources aren't going to be available till October. When you have things like these allocations for tabulators and stuff like that, puts a lot of pressure on the department to quickly determine exactly how that's going to operate and then quickly get that out the door. So like any budget, there's going to be several line items in here, whether it's that or anything else. That's going to take some time for these departments to get a handle on what they are. And quite frankly, there are many departments that might not have even have known the line item existed until the budget passed. And so
Hmm.
they might not have been prepared for it. They might not have asked for it. And now they need to sort of go about dealing with it. That's sort of the downside and the potential, negatives of doing budgets at the very last minute is there's often surprises in there that departments or other institutions have to deal with.
All right. Well, I want to get to revenue sharing. Let's
Yep.
turn to that. This
Yeah.
budget makes some changes there too. Let's, from a high level start, walk us through what's happening with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to sort of level set in this space,
Yeah.
we talk about both constitutional revenue sharing, which is is based on sales tax collection, and that constitutional revenue sharing only goes to cities, villages, and townships. And
Right.
then we have statutory revenue sharing, which goes to those three entities plus counties. And really, what this budget did is looked at both of those pieces, plus they've talked about public safety, and then you intertwine that with roads because of the policy change that we had talked about earlier. And the advocacy becomes challenging at times because as much as we want to partner with and work collectively with like the Michigan Association of Counties and the Michigan Townships Association, depending on what's going on, each of us were impacted very differently in that revenue sharing space this year, right?
Hmm.
Townships don't get road funding. Counties themselves, outside of a handful, don't get road funding. It goes to the county road agencies. We are the only local government group that gets both statutory, constitutional, and road funding. And then when you put in a new pot for public safety, we also get that, but townships and counties were eligible as well. So without a doubt, in the overall grand scheme of things, the ability to have a significant transportation funding package does help offset any potential change in resources from revenue sharing. Now, when we look at this, we were very, very fortunate to hold statutory harmless and maintain the three-factor funding formula that was instituted in the last budget cycle. That is
Well, and
really,
I
yeah,
I think I want to give a shout out to our members who responded and when we called on them last week, the week
yeah,
before. It's all blurring to me now, but that email that we sent out to folks that
mhm,
we needed your help, I think really made a difference. Can you speak to that, John,
yeah,
before you sort of go on?
exactly. And I got a call Friday at some point. It was in the afternoon, and it was to reassure me that our advocacy efforts on that statutory piece made a difference. And I
Hmm.
can tell you, just talking to legislators in general, they felt the pressure. Uh,
Yeah,
Not just the pressure to do something, but the pressure to be accountable to it. And that's really important. And sort of in the reflection and the recap of all the things that go on, one of the things that was mentioned to me by somebody we work with is oftentimes we are not at the negotiating table when it comes
hmm,
down to the last few days and weeks. In this particular case, we were at the negotiating table to the very, very last minute. Literally, one of the last issues to be resolved was revenue sharing. And a lot of that
hmm,
had to do with the fact that not only from an advocacy standpoint did we engage and do that sort of boots on the ground, but our members were loud and participatory, and that forced legislators to be participatory. Now, I can't share all the stories I know because that would be breaking, some of the lobbyist code of being able to get good intel. But what I
of
can tell
course.
you is that there were several legislators that found it important enough to raise it publicly behind closed doors. And when we're getting that to happen on a consistent basis down to the very last minute within these negotiations, we know that makes a difference. We also know that that has carryover. And so very
Hmm.
often people will remember those conversations. So the next time they want to do something, it's a lot harder for local government to just sort of become the target. And that word may not be entirely fair in this case because where we really saw the negative net impact is on the constitutional side, and that was because of the policy change. And we had talked about, previously the governor and the speaker, agreeing to backfill that, and then the changes that happened, along the way that made that much more difficult. Now, schools were backfilled. Local government simply because of the road funding deal, there were many that thought because of those resources being out there, it would be easier to not backfill the constitutional piece for local gov. Now, if you're a township, you're in a very different spot. And I can tell you, having worked very closely with their lead lobbyist on this, we work to both not just talk about the impact of cities and villages, and we may have some on here today. We represent a couple of townships, but to make sure that we really tried to carry the water collectively and speak in unison on that, which we did. because in no way do we think that a reduction to constitutional revenue sharing by not backfilling that is acceptable. Quite frankly, we're
Hmm.
disappointed. At
Yeah.
the end of the day, the end outcome when you couple that with protecting statutory and then having a brand new piece for public safety, which puts $70 million into public safety efforts across the state, and then having a transportation package primarily focused on local roads, we get to a spot where I think we can feel good that the efforts made this much better than what it could have been. And two, that we raise the position of both the organization and local issues for future conversations. That's not always a good consolation prize, but
Right.
what I will say is, you know, most of what we do is based on influence.
Hmm.
And where there were several other spaces within this budget that either didn't get funded again or took severe haircuts, we were in a position from an organizational standpoint to really kind of hold on and improve at the same time and do the best we could with the situation we were faced. And the members that I have talked to seem to be both appreciative of that, but also recognize, the long-term benefits of what happened on the road piece, even though there were some challenges in the revenue sharing space.
Sure. So, as you're out there talking to members, as I'm sure we're going to be in the next coming weeks, months, etc., um, and fielding some more of these questions, what's the message as our members look ahead, right? The budget takes effect and those dollars are starting to hit, like you said, January, but really like March-ish. What's that message that you would carry out to our members?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One, and I talked about this in some of the comments that I made to the press. It's
Hmm.
really trying to get people to understand the value on an ongoing basis of local government and really talking about the need for the state to be partners with. And we talk about this in our My Home program
Sure.
proposal, right? But how do we make sure that we are good partners with the state? And so when they're talking about, the collective success of what's going on, how do we make sure that we continue to be relevant in that conversation? I think that's one. And then two, I think we need to be honest, right? I mean, if there are impacts to your budget as a result of this, don't be afraid to let them know, both where there may be challenges and two, where there are successes, right? And there's clearly going to be probably some of both, depending on, what the unique situation is in your community. It's that honesty that allows us to go out and advocate better the next time this comes around. Um, you know, they talk about being a transparent budget, and there is
Hmm.
more transparency added to it, sort of on the enhancement grant side, special projects, things like that. But legislators should feel as if they have enough time to make an informed decision. A lot of that doesn't happen in the moment. A lot of that happens by us educating them beforehand. So the
Right.
more time that we can spend talking to them about our budgets, introducing them to both our successes and our challenges, the easier it's going to be for us, in those tense, sort of very limited, time frame moments to be successful. And we are seeing some of that. I shouldn't make it sound like we aren't.
Hmm.
We are absolutely in a position to have a greater impact, which is why I talked about, being at the table at the very last minute. That's important, right? That's how we get things done, and that is how we will derive future successes in this space.
Sure. And it's not something we've always had in the past,
It is not.
is that seat at the table at the very last second. A couple of questions that have come in, John. One says, I've seen conflicting info about the status of placemaking funding like RAP grants and MEDC's PSCP grants. Can you please share any insight on these potential funding opportunities or any others?
Yeah. So I can speak specifically about the RAP program because actually I was just updating staff on this.
Yeah.
So when we think about the economic development category in general that's been specifically talked about in that space, there were two things. There were the Revitalization and Placemaking Grants, or RAP, and the Housing and Community Development Fund. The Housing and Community Development Fund had 50 million in it. That's going to continue to be funded. The RAP program, which is a priority of ours, which we had hoped would continue to receive funding, actually was scheduled to no longer be funded after the fiscal year that just expired. And so from our standpoint, it wasn't so much about maintaining the funding or it being cut. It was about convincing others that it was still valuable to have. And I think
Mhm.
there are some out there that clearly still see that. And it's one of those things that, while yes, it's not going to be funded in this current cycle, I think there's clear avenues for us to go out and advocate for that on an ongoing basis. And we're going to continue to do that. I think the other one was the uh,
Pub
public space, community
Yep,
place uh, stuff. I mean, there is still some ongoing, at least based on our initial review for some of that. So they're not completely abandoning placemaking as a core theme and some of the stuff that they're looking at. But there was some expiring funding that is going to go away. So from our efforts, placemaking and the concept of investing in thriving communities is going to be at the top of our efforts in the way in which we look through things. And we're going to continue to try to advocate to make sure that there's as many resources as possible going to those.
absolutely. Okay, next question. Any restrictions on the use of the public safety funding?
Yeah, so public safety funding did turn out slightly different. So
Mhm.
initially, about a year and a half ago, when it first passed, there was about 170, or excuse me, $75 million specifically dedicated to public safety, and it was distributed to cities, villages, and townships based on a violent crime statistic. So it was a 3-year rolling average, essentially, of Michigan State Police violent crime statistics. That has actually changed drastically, both prior to this budget passing, as both the Senate had something very different and the House added a county sheriff component to it. The final version of this scaled that back to 50 mil, or excuse me, $70 million, 50 of which was ongoing, and of that 50, 42 and a half was going to cities, villages, and townships. So I'll focus on that part,
Yeah.
um, because the initial one had some very clear restrictions within it. And it also didn't allow you to supplant resources. So you couldn't say, hey, we're spending $1 million on public safety. Now we're getting 100,000 and then, pull that 100,000 out the back. That non-supplant language does not exist. And part of the reason we believe it doesn't exist is because we knew there was some shuffling of resources going on kind of between pots of revenue sharing, particularly when you consider constitutional. So it allows some additional flexibility there. And then two, a minimum of 75% of that needs to be spent in the police space. Okay. There's now greater flexibility with up to 25% of that funding to be spent on things like EMS, firefighter, 911, mental health services, those types of things. So while the pot may be a little bit smaller,
Mhm.
the overall flexibility within that pot is actually much greater, but they are still using the violent crime metric in which to do that. So, one of the documents in the blog that we posted the other day is actually a reflection of what we anticipate those resources to be. And I kind of created a little math problem that if you want to know what your net impact is, you can take that number and combine it with the constitutional reduction, and it will kind of tell you your net impact. Now, I'm always very cautious here, and this is a not so much a warning, just like just an announcement for you to be aware of. But those numbers are preliminary, and I can
Mhm.
tell you we've already found a couple of mistakes within those numbers. So while it is a good estimate, I wouldn't take that number to the bank just yet. And there's two reasons for it. One, they try to get these numbers together very quickly to give people some idea of what was going on. On the transportation side, we actually anticipate maybe as soon as late this week or early next week, they might put out a 5-year projection. So stay tuned for that. And then the other thing is both constitutional and road funding dollars are based on actual collections. And so they are always going to be estimates, but it is going to be that actual collection that drives that number. Statutory will be fixed at 333 million, so that statutory number will be accurate. but that public safety and roads very much sort of in the early stages of coming up with those right now. And over the course of time, we'll flex a little bit too because it's based on actual collections. But it should give you a good ballpark as to where you're at.
Thanks, John. So zooming back out, if we're thinking about the months ahead, what should all of us local government folks be paying attention to as these changes take effect?
Yeah, I think early on, we're not going to see much difference. And part of
Right.
that is because it really doesn't get implemented until January 1. So we gotta keep that in mind as to when these changes will actually take place. But I'm going to come back to a little bit what we were talking about beforehand, which, when you get into these budget situations like we dealt with here, there's no better time than now to communicate with your
Mhm.
legislator. Um, it is that constant sort of drumbeat of what we do and what impacts, again, both positive and negative are, and talking to legislators honestly about that, because the scariest part right now is that typically in any other year, state departments will be delivering their request to the governor for next fiscal year's budget within 30 days from right now.
Mhm.
The governor is going to put out her next budget recommendations in February. And so, for those things that we care about, whether that be funding, whether it be programmatically, you name it, whether it be policy wise, that's got to be said now. There's no rest for the weary in this case. Because that next budget cycle really starts immediately in terms of crafting it, understanding where things are. And it'll be February before we know it. And the governor will be doing her State of the State address, be releasing her budget, and we'll be right back into this cycle. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll have our next budget in 9 months when July 1 shows up. And so we'll have some more
Yeah.
certainty in that space. But that turnaround is going to be very quick. So if we say, hey, it's over, we'll wait a little bit. That can't happen right now. We got to be able to talk to our legislators, keep that open line of communication, and let them know what we think.
All right. One more question in through the chat. Do I understand it correctly that the public safety dollars are new?
Public safety dollars are new. And I'm going to say something, and this is like where budget details and intent sometimes line up, sometimes
Mhm.
they don't. So there's absolutely no question that public safety dollars are new. There's no question that of those dollars, about 20 million of it is really identified, 20 million of the 70 million really identified as one time. So it's really much more of about a $50 million pot. But that $50 million pot has legislative intent language, which, is fancy speak for in the budget. They literally write, it is the intent of the legislature to. And in this case, they wrote that it is the intent of the legislature to only fund that public safety fund for the next 3 fiscal years. That was a bit of a surprise to us. And I'm not trying to make anybody too worried about this just yet. One, because the money's not coming into our hands just yet, and it will here in the coming months. But sometimes hiring practices can be done on that. And so we'll work hard to sort of get an answer as to what the real purpose of that intent language was. And can we consider that to be ongoing funding in perpetuity? Or should we really be communicating, or will we need to communicate to you as our members that you might want to be a little bit more careful with this funding because it may only be in the budget for the next 3 fiscal years? So we'll work to do that. So new funding, pretty stable on the onset, but something that we'll have to dive in and get some more details on to make sure that you have the information you needed to make good budget decisions going forward.
Sure. So major hurdle has been crossed. There is a budget, but guess what? Advocacy doesn't stop once the budget has been cleared. So, John, I want to talk very briefly to wrap us up. We still have issues that we're working on that are issues that we are going to continue, especially into the fall. So, one of those is the My Home program.
Yeah.
Um, can you just talk a little bit about what that's looking like now that the budget's sort
Yeah.
of through where we need to be? What's next for that advocacy piece in particular, and what should our members expect?
Yeah, there's probably two main components that we'll be focusing on. One will be introduction, right? And that will be the most outward sign that our members will see and something that they'll be able to respond and react to and talk to their legislators about. The second is really behind the scenes. You just heard me talk about the budget proposal and the governor's executive recs. We'll be
Hmm.
trying to work with the administration to see if that is something that we can get included in that. That's very difficult to do. I don't want to sort of give the impression that we think that that's going to happen, but in terms of trying to talk about the importance of these things, highlighting that, having those conversations with the administration, our goal would be to hopefully have her include that within her final budget recommendation. Should that not be included, that really makes that legislation that much more important to work with
Hmm.
legislators and to work with appropriators through that process to see if we can't get that funded. So that's there. I mean, and then I'm always willing to make a cheap plug for our revenue sharing trust fund.
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah, I figured it might be, right? And to be honest, we did that a ton throughout the last couple of weeks.
Hmm.
Part of it is maybe you can get that attached to the budget as a policy recommendation. But two, anytime that they're sort of messing on the margins around revenue sharing, it's just important to kind of keep it relevant. But what I know just from a pure action standpoint, and two, from a response standpoint, when talking to legislators, this budget highlighted more than ever why we need to have that in place. And I think
Hmm.
what we have seen and what we have heard from legislators inside those caucuses is they agree with that.
Yep.
So the next question becomes is, can we take that next step? And so we'll be hyper focused on that as we have been as the league's number one policy priority. There's some additional, sort of uh, anticipation. I should say anticipation. There's some additional need for that now based on what we've seen, and I think people
Hmm.
realize. Um, so all in all, I don't want to make it sound as if it was a bad couple of weeks. It was a hard couple of weeks, but it was a couple of weeks where once again our members stepped up and showed the value that they have and that they maintain in this space. And while it didn't work out the exact way we wanted it to, um, the spot that we landed on is one that we will still be able to build off of in the future for a variety of reasons. We should figure out how we go about doing that the best we can, and then layer in good policy ideas on top of this, in future years and sessions. And that'll be our goal, at the end of the day, and hopefully we can continue to gain the support of our members in this space, and just happy to be able to represent each of them and their participation in this cycle.
Absolutely. And a major kudos to you and all of our state and federal affairs team who have been there really throughout this entire process. And you all still have your foot on the gas as it
And,
relates to
and
getting into the fall.
And I should say, I was thinking maybe we might only go 20 or 25 minutes, and
I
sounds
know
like
I laughed when you said that before we hopped on, that this would only
pretty
take us a
easier for
quick
me
15 minutes.
to kind of do this. And it just so happens that I'm on today, but Jen
Hmm.
and Harrisana and Dave and Betsy play a massive role
Yep.
in what goes on. And we were talking about this again. It's at our staff meeting today, and it's not just them. It's really our entire team in this organization in terms of our communication efforts. And I gave a big thank you to Dan and Summer and Tony, who are open and at the ready to take my phone call at any point in time to ask them questions. Them being in this space, previously just allows us to sort of bounce ideas, make sure we're making the right decisions at the right time as best we can on behalf of our members. But I am blessed to have an amazing team that I get to work with, amazing support staff across the organization in terms of being able to deliver timely information to our members. And I couldn't be more proud of them and being a part of this organization.
Absolutely. I echo that too. One quick question that has come in through the chat before we close out today. What's the date again that the budget dollars will be seen? The 24
Yeah.
billion for schools, for instance. And
Yeah.
also are those dollars for specific uses only?
Yeah. So I can't say that I know all the specifics of the school aid budget. If I
Yeah.
did, that would really mean I was losing sleep. But What we know, so just again, just to sort of give a couple of dates, the continuation budget ends on October 8th. We
Mhm.
anticipate that the governor will sign this full budget by then. When she does, those dollars are available essentially immediately. What I do know is that the next school aid payment happens on October 21st. We fully anticipate that that payment will happen on time, and then we will see that ongoing payment in out months tracking with the new budget. So it's really now. And we're on schedule to deliver that as we normally would.
Thanks, John. All right. Thanks to all of you for hopping on this special edition of Live with the League. We'll be back to our regular schedule Monday, this coming Monday. We will be on the road and we'll be excited to see you there. As always, have a great week. And again, super big shout out to all of you who spoke to your legislators and to our team who made this budget season what it was. So thank you all, and we will see you next week.